Today we're going to be looking at the AQA Language Paper 1, Question 4. Question 4 is a big one. It's the big 20 marker, which means you're going to spend around 20 minutes on it. Now, please remember, stick to your timings. I always say this, but you've got to stick to them religiously in the language paper. Even if you haven't finished the answer, if you were meant to write 4 paragraphs, but you only wrote 3, you've got to move on because you're going to run out of time for question 5, which is worth even more marks. So make sure we stick to our 20 minutes. Question 4 looks like this. Focus this part of your answer on the second half of the source from line 16 to the end. A student said, "This part of the story set during breakfast time shows that Alex is struggling to cope with his mother's illness. To what extent do you agree?" So basically they give you a statement and then they say, "A student once said," or "A critic once said." No one said it. They've basically given you a statement that they think is true and they want you to write maybe 2 paragraphs, finding quotes and analysing them about why that statement might be true. And then maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs, finding quotations and analysing them about why the statement isn't true. You can do 2 agree paragraphs and 1 disagree. It doesn't have to be an even split. You can even just do 3 agree paragraphs. I agree with the statement, agree and agree. I think it helps thinking about the language paper as a whole. Every question you have done so far has built up to this moment. Question 1, they made you practice selecting quotations. Question 2, they did like a mini warm-up of looking for language devices and analysing them. Question 3, they made you think about structure. And now, for question 4, you're going to put all of that together. Let's remind ourselves about the extract, line 16 to the end. In the actual exam, you know how I feel about line numbers. I would draw a box around those lines, 16 to the end, in a different coloured pen to make sure you don't accidentally write about the wrong lines. Let's read it. At breakfast, Alex was not in the mood to applaud his father's efforts at making pancakes. "When's Mama going to get better?" Nicole asked, trying to spare a rubbery pancake with her fork. "You two are just kids. You don't know what you're talking about," Alex exclaimed. Alex was angry with his father, his sisters, life in general, even with his mother for getting sick. He rushed out of the kitchen, ready to leave without breakfast. Alex had realised during those months how enormous their mother's presence had been and how painful her absence was now. He missed her easy laughter and her affection, even her discipline. She was stricter than his father and sharper. It was impossible to fool her. She could see the unseeable. He missed her music, her flowers, the once familiar fragrance of fresh-baked cookies, and the smell of paint. Now, she barely got out of bed to walk through the rooms with a confused air, as if she didn't recognize anything. She was too thin, and her sunken eyes were circled with shadows. Her canvases, which were once explosions of color, sat forgotten in their easels, and her oil paints dried in their tubes. His mother seemed to have shrunk. She was little more than a silent ghost. Is Alex struggling to cope with his mother's illness? I think he is. So let's pick out our 3 juiciest quotations, and that means quotations that have interesting language devices in there or structural devices that will prove Alex is struggling to cope. I'm going to go for Alex was angry with his father, his sisters, life in general, because there's a rule of 3 there. And actually, if you're really clever, you'll notice that in that rule of 3, each thing gets bigger. So we've got his father, that's 1. Then we've got his sisters, that's 2. And we've got life in general, that's the biggest. And perhaps that shows he's struggling because it represents how his emotions are becoming overwhelming and he's becoming increasingly frustrated. I'm then going to use the quotation, his mother seemed to have shrunk. She was little more than a silent ghost. Now, in that one, I can talk about how a metaphor is being used because she's not actually a ghost, but I can zoom into that word ghost and say how it shows how scared Alex is and how his mother's possible death is constantly on his mind. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to write one example paragraph for you using the quotation, "You two are just kids. You don't know what you're talking about." Copy it down for me. You can use this paragraph that we're about to write as a template when you are writing your own paragraphs. Let's go. Firstly, I strongly agree that Alex is struggling to cope with his mother's illness because of the way he refuses to interact with his family, as shown through the use of dialogue. You two are just kids, you don't know what you're talking about. Here, the repeated use of direct address in you creates an accusatory tone, as if Alex is almost blaming his mother's illness on his younger siblings, which exemplifies his irrational state of mind. The fact that he refers to them as kids creates the impression that he feels they don't fully understand the severity of their mother's condition and thinks he is suffering alone. The exclamation mark represents his frustration, as he is clearly raising his voice and unable to control his overwhelming emotions. The idea of Alex struggling to control his emotions is further reinforced through the use of short sentences. Evidently, Alex is incapable of sharing his worries with anyone. The monosyllabic words further cement how difficult he finds it to even discuss the topic of his mother's illness, as he would rather shut the conversation down. This emotional outburst conveys his instability, showing he is clearly struggling with his mother's illness. Now, if we break down what I have just done, this is it. I wrote a point that answers the question using words from the question, from the statement. But notice I included a because and I gave a reason. I didn't just say, I agree he's struggling to cope. I said, I agree he's struggling to cope because. So I didn't just repeat the statement, I included a method that the writer uses and a reason. After that, I selected a juicy quotation. It was not too long, it was not too short, but it had juice in it. It had some language devices and interesting words. Then I identified the language device or an interesting word choice and analyzed the effect, linking back to the question. The explanation here is much longer than for previous questions because this question is worth way more marks. Now, because I'm a grade 9, I gave myself some extra marks because I analysed the exclamation mark. So I looked at punctuation, which is always a nice way to just get a couple of extra marks. And then I reinforced what I'm saying about Alex by talking about structure. You just need to write 3 or 4 of these to get your 20 marks. So there you have it. Language paper 1, question 4, 20 marker in the bag. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, give it a like and don't forget to check out the rest of the videos in this series.